I will start as usual with our land acknowledgement. The place where the Clay Studio stands and where I sit today is part of the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine, which is especially appropriate for today's Lunch and Learn because we are going to be talking about Peaceable Kingdom, a painting by Edward Hicks that depicts Penn's treaty with the Indians. And we're going to drill down into that thanks to the presence of both Peter Barbor, President Alum, and Laura Igoe. So first I'll introduce them, and then we're going to talk about Peter's show, which you can see looming above him in the background. And then Laura's going to give us some really great insights into that historical painting. Peter Barbor is an alum of the Clay Studio Resident Artist Program. He has lived and worked across North America. He received his BFA with honors in ceramics from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2010. In 2017, he graduated from the University of Washington's 3D4M program, earning the DeCilia Teaching with Excellence Award. He was then visiting faculty in ceramics at the Alberta University of the Arts in Calgary. And this fall, Peter will be a new clay instructor at the Ellis School in Pittsburgh. Thank you for joining us, Peter. He drove his work across the state a couple of days ago. Go Pennsylvania. Laura Turner Igoe, PhD, is the chief curator at the James A. Michener Art Museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. If those of you in the area haven't been there, please go visit. It is amazing. She has held curatorial and research positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where we met, Princeton University Art Museum, Harvard Art Museums, and the Barnes Foundation. Laura is the co-editor of A Green Country Town, Philadelphia's Ecology and the Cultural Imagination, and she has contributed essays to the journals American Art, Panorama, Commonplace, and the exhibition catalog Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment. At the Michener, she curated Impressionism to Modernism, Rising Tides, Contemporary Art in the Ecology of Water last year, which was amazing and included wonderful ceramic work. Through the Lens, Modern Photography in the Delaware Valley, and she is preparing for the upcoming exhibition, Daring Design, the Impact of Three Women on Wharton Esherick's Craft, which will open at the Michener on September 10th. So I think hoping that the Clay Studio takes a field trip up there, and maybe Laura will show us around that show in the fall. I'm going to start by asking Peter to answer my kind of standard question, which is, when and how did you make the brave decision to make your life in art?
Thanks for that question, Jennifer. And also thank you everyone for tuning in today with us. And thanks, Laura, for being here. I think art has always been kind of central to my identity and just a part of who I am. And I think, you know, I'm not so certain that it was super brave because I'm very fortunate to have had two very supportive parents, right? And the privilege of kind of being raised, encouraged to follow your passion and to study it and take a really hearty stab at making it what you do. So I think, you know, I've always been that kid who's just like constantly doodling on every surface. And then also, you know, like squishing clay that I found in my parents' backyard. And ironically, that same clay has actually traveled here to Philadelphia today and it's been worked into my pieces. So that's kind of a full circle to that question. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. I love that fact that you are going back to that early material that you literally were playing with the same thing. Tell us a little bit about how you made the decision to go to college for art and why you chose clay as your initial main material, although you know you have such an expansive practice, but I feel like you've said to me it kind of always comes back to clay in a certain way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess when I got into the Rhode Island School of Design, I think I went in with the idea that I would become an illustration major. And I think, you know, it kind of just seemed like going to school for something that seemed kind of almost like an outlet of commercial art was a logical and safe choice, right? And that my portfolio was predominantly drawings. So like figure drawings from observation, out of charcoal, and a little bbit of clay and a little bit of like found object sculpture. And I think that after my foundation year at RISD, I like, as Larry Bush, my late teacher at RISD once said, people fall into ceramics. They just fall into it. And I think that that's accurate, because I decided illustration would make me kind of unhappy, like having to always work towards a prompt. And there's something about this connection between drawing and ceramics and clay and touch that was like really important to me. And also how clay is just such a versatile vocabulary. So I think, I've definitely expanded into using other materials. And I'm almost like clay adjacent now, right? Like it's not something, I don't get too preoccupied like thinking like, oh, I'm going to fire my work. But I think when you look at my work, hopefully you can see like elements of slab construction or elements of like how someone made coil build. And so how like a learning how to make through clay and a learning through drawing is always something that's foundational to like my work and how I navigate making.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I love that when you first answered the question, you said you didn't feel it was brave, but then when you talked about choosing clay, you were moving away from the safe choice. So maybe some kind of art was always in the cards, but you moved from what was safe illustration, which has kind of a commercial application, or can at least, to something that you went like as far in the other direction as possible, because at times you make work that basically is intended to just fall apart, right?
Absolutely. Not always. And I don't think this work is necessarily, but yeah, definitely thinking about like lifespans of materials and how that can almost be a conceptual component of a work. Yeah.
Yeah. Was there a particular professor, like you talked about Larry Bush, and I know he was an amazing technician. Was there a professor in college that infused or encouraged that idea to let go of the, I don't know, the permanent and work towards ephemeral? Or do you feel like that was your own, I don't know?
I think so many professors kind of have contributed to like my development. So right off the bat, like having Linda Sorman be one of the first ceramic professors I ever worked with, that just totally exploded my vocabulary of like what material can do and what ceramics can manifest as. And then Shannon Goff, I was really fortunate enough to be mentored by her for gosh, oh my gosh, we're like going on over a decade now. And she's just a phenomenal mentor and someone who, her like irreverence towards material and her fluidity between like cardboard and clay and other adjacent materials definitely just exploded my notions of like what I could achieve through a ceramic education. When I was at the University of Washington, Kate Roberts was a lecturer there, and just working kind of adjacent to her, she had a studio with the grad students, and seeing how she kind of navigated that whole subject of ephemerality with clay. We definitely take like different approaches and have different instincts in our work, but there's a lot of material overlap. And so being in conversation with her as well definitely pushed me closer to that direction. And that whole program, like working with Ami McNeil and Doug Jack, and just being able to expand like when I went into grad school, I pretty much was just a slip and score kind of guy. And I kind of learned, how to like get a drill going and use a wood shop. So, those are other things that kind of just exploded my knowledge of working.
Yeah, moving out into those other materials. And, in our conversations, you've often referenced these teachers, which is kind of why I was asking that question. I feel like that's really important to you as you evolved. And now you get a chance starting this fall to be a mentor to young students. I mean, they'll be high school kids, right?
Yep.
But I'm asking you super hard questions with no warning, sorry. Is there something that you hope particularly to be able to impart to these young people in their pursuit of art?
Definitely. I mean, I think like sometimes I think in our culture, there is such a preoccupation with like being perfect. And I think that clay can be an antidote to that. And so for these students, I hope that my class can kind of be a space that's safe for them to explore, a space where they can kind of think that art, can be a way that they can navigate other subjects. So like how can their work in ceramics connect to what they're doing in English or math or science? And how can it also maybe just like open their eyes to like, when they're walking on a brick sidewalk, are they suddenly aware that there's ceramics supporting their feet? Like is their kitchen cupboard suddenly a more active space in their imagination? And I hope that that's something that my class can do for them at a young age.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I mean, the idea of just giving the gift of being aware of your surroundings and appreciating them, and also connecting to other subjects is a great segue to ask you to kind of dive into your thought process that brought you to this show, which was how you got interested in this painting, Peaceable Kingdom, and then where that led you. So do you want to share your screen with us?
Sure thing. I will share that screen. 1 second here, queuing it up. All right, is that working for everybody?
Yeah, looks great.
My first slide is one of the 62 versions of the Peaceable Kingdom that Hicks painted, that I had the fortune of guarding at the Worcester Art Museum. When I was a resident artist at the Worcester Center for Crafts, I worked part-time at the Worcester Art Museum as a guard. So I spent a lot of shifts in an ill-fitted blazer, kind of just telling people to stay 12 inches away from these very fragile early American paintings. And in particular, I spent a lot of time just kind of circulating around this version of Edward Hicks painting. And I think, you know, the idea or like the motif of the Peaceable Kingdom is something that I think, you know, it's from the book of Isaiah in the Bible, but it also proliferates throughout lots of folk art. And Hicks is definitely kind of the one who made it a kind of, I don't know, a cornerstone of a lot of early American art. So thinking about this opportunity to show here in Philadelphia at the Clay Studio, and thinking about Hicks, who is an artist from Bucks County and being an artist who also is born and raised in Pennsylvania, I was kind of like in a really weird mental space because it seemed like Pennsylvania suddenly this past fall became like this epicenter of like stress and trauma and like, wow, which way will the Keystone State go? And thinking about our identity as this Keystone State, like where Pennsylvania seems to be just so many different microcosms of like America coexisting within each other. So like it immediately brought back to mind the idea of the Peaceable Kingdom, especially the foreground of this painting. And so I was thinking like, gosh, like I want to make something that's not, I usually make figures. I wanted to make something that was maybe more like just a different subject matter, because that was also kind of like less stressful in this like in the political turmoil we were experiencing. So I guess like I was like, I kind of want to work from this painting. A lot of times I kind of mine history as a source for my work. And having spent so much time with this particular version, it just immediately came to mind when I was talking with you, Jennifer, about kind of conceiving this installation and and getting it up. So yeah, let me think, I'm losing my train of thought here, sorry. But yeah, so I guess I conjured to mind this painting and thought about like how wonderful it would be, right, to exist in a world opposite of like the Trump v. Biden warfare that we were kind of experiencing and being blasted with at all times. And also just like the personal kind of turmoil and chaos that we were all experiencing, you know, when we have neighbors who we've been friends with our whole lives who maybe have different ideologies, and how it just felt like, gosh, are we really unraveling? Like America is really, it just feels different than it ever has in my entire lifespan. And perhaps that's good. Perhaps the disruption actually will lead to like healing. But I think in other ways, it was a lot to swallow. And so I guess like looking at this painting too, it's unavoidable to also kind of notice the backdrop of this painting, which kind of takes like a classical parallel structure where like there's like, you know, this Peaceable Kingdom, then it's kind of predicated by what's happening in the backdrop, which is William Penn's treaty with the Lenni and Lenape. And thinking about how, you know, like this is basically a kind of a form of early American propaganda, and how it kind of led me to this other thing I was thinking about, which is this idea of the chimera. So I have this humorous Keystone State here, which was just my way of kind of illustrating how I like to be like, Pennsylvania is awesome, but also look at our ridiculous state, right? I'm from about here, if you guys can see my cursor, from Indiana County. So, you know, we still kind of say we're from Pittsburgh or Picksburg, and we, you know, we might bust a yins on you guys instead of a yous guys or whatever you guys do out here. We definitely have the weirder accent too, right? But, you know, I'm from this corner of the state.
Yeah, they're both pretty weird.
And then if you move like our little heads to the side here, you can kind of see, you know, how that strangely mirrors the political map from this past election. And yeah, you don't need to get too much into that.
And it should be noted that you moved from Philadelphia back to Pittsburgh during this time period. So you had just this like super intense, in your face understanding of like what it was like to be in Philadelphia, and then what it was like to be closer to Pittsburgh. Yeah.
And also like in the past 10 years or more, I've lived all over the country. And I think there's just something that I have to throw out there in this conversation about how I think it's so interesting to be a Pennsylvanian, because sometimes people think you're a Midwesterner. Sometimes people think you're like from New England. Sometimes people think you're even more Southern. And it truly is like, I think that's the great part of Pennsylvania, right? It's just like interesting to be someone who maybe can't be classified. So that brings me to this idea of the chimera, which has two different definitions. And so you can see this lovely illustration by Jacopo, blanking on the last name, is right there, but covered by the thing.
There you go.
Thank you. So, you know, we're familiar with the mythological version of a chimera, but it also, you know, can be used to describe a thing that is hoped or wished for, but in fact is illusory or impossible to achieve. And so, not to be too pessimistic, but like thinking about that foreground and how it can almost lull us into a state of complacency. It's like there's this monster of a chimera that's at war with its body, and then you think of the Peaceable Kingdom as this illusory or very difficult to achieve utopic thing, where its body's at rest, but they're also all the same kind of animals at rest in this peaceful setting. And how maybe that optimism of Hicks painting and that Quaker optimism is something that sadly, like, we can aspire for, but really I was not feeling it. You know, it was a visceral thing. I was like so sick to my stomach throughout this fall. And I'm sure many of us were. So that's a little bit about the background of this, the concept of the pieces, but I also love showing process. And so I just have some slides here that show kind of like after months and months and months of trying to make work that I think could like mount on the wall and kind of relate to like the idea of a painting like Hicks, the source material. I made these like armatures out of pine and that rebar remesh that you might find at like the big box store that's always rusty and like shoved under the shelves. Like I walked past it probably millions of times before I saw it and was like, aha, this is the stuff. And so I kind of like brushed up on my skills that again are not slip and score skills, but just so I could get to the fun part where I really got the clay in between my fingers. And you can see how I kind of started to accumulate material on these armatures and started to kind of describe the animals on them. So this is actually like the lamb or the sheep is how I kind of like refer to it myself. And how like, you know, like I like to think about like expanding like how we use clay. So it's like, you know, clay is also used in like architectural applications where it is mixed with straw and it lasts for a really long time. Yeah, it's sort of ephemeral, but yeah, it also creates like these buildings that last probably longer than I'll live. We look at like also like how I construct it and thinking again, like I'm translating ideas of slab building. So like when I was really solely working with clay, I was always really stretching a skin of clay and like building slabs and always working also with like clay armatures and then removing them or firing them inside the work. So a lot of the knowledge that I gained in my education was again being applied to the construction of these objects. And you can see how it kind of slowly accumulated material and kind of wrapped up there. And just also like where I sourced material. So like the bottom of these pieces is this clay that I found like literally in Indiana County near my parents' property and kind of cleaned up and slaked down and put in a bucket and was working with like a lot of it for all of this year. And so that was something I'm actually grateful for the pandemic is like looking at what's around us and like thinking like, how do I adapt to this new reality? And just some more process and then leading into kind of just how the gallery looks around me. Again, like thinking about drawing, like so the straw man in this installation kind of relates to the human figures in Hicks paintings. And you can see here, like I was again kind of constructing it, thinking of it almost as a drawing. So I made this grid out of just like fencing wire from like Tractor Supply. And then it kind of accumulated a mixture of hydrocal and straw on top of that grid to just loosely describe the figure. But it literally emerged almost the same as like a subtractive charcoal drawing where you're like taking away and adding material. And that's like where my headspace is as I was working through that piece. I'm just going to move through the pairings of animals. So the animals I chose to take from the Peaceable Kingdom all are in verse 6 of that. So it's chapter 11, verse 6. So we'll just move through those pairings, but I also like to frame these animals also as diptychs. So like they're together as they are in the biblical verse, but they're also like strangely apart and trying to build kind of a tension with that. And they're also kind of floating off the wall. So like, I like that kind of like just that slight tension that this format provides. So we have the lion and like the bull, and a leopard and a goat, and the sheep, or the lamb and the wolf. And again, thinking about these objects and how they're constructed, like they compose an image right now, but like anyone who's worked in ceramics knows you'd never put plaster with clay. Like that's bad. That's like the ultimate sin of the ceramic studio. So like these compositions, these materials, like, again, they'll sustain this image for a long time, as long as they're treated like any painting would be treated. But also conceptually, they're materials that are at odds with one another, and they're kind of chimeras in and of themselves. And the way that I titled these animals, I'm just going to stop with this slide here before we transition to Laura, is I was, again, like kind of struggling, like I don't want to just name it like goat. So I was thinking about like, how can I find a title that relates again to the concept of the source imagery, and also just like what I was kind of thinking about in terms of like utopia and chimera. And I decided to just use the scientific names of the animals, because when you telescope out from that, the overarching umbrella of all of this is the animal kingdom. So like the hope that, you know, when we zoom out enough from like where we have conflict with one another, we're actually more connected than you may think. So for instance, like the lion is titled Panthera leo, and you can just kind of move around the pieces using the genus and species name there. So that's my last slide. And I hope if anyone has any questions, we can handle them later, I guess.
Oh yeah, if everyone please put questions into the chat, and we'll get back to them. I think it's really important. I love that you ended on the slide to talk about how things are connected, and the idea that I love the idea of you standing in front of that painting for however many hours and just feeling both a sense of peace that it's kind of intending to provide, but also understanding that it's problematic. And that you can then apply that to just like the general problematic nature of social justice issues that we're dealing with, and we've always dealt with in the United States, but certainly have come more to the forefront in the last year. And then with my art historical background, but not super, not a super strong focus on this period, I was excited to learn that Laura Igoe has done some really important thinking about this piece and Hicks in general. So I was excited to then ask Laura, like, let's get some historical context about the problematic nature of the painting, and the idea of how many versions there are. And, you know, this to me indicates that it's always been a bit of a question mark. So if Peter wants to end his share, then we can ask Laura to give us a little bit of historical insight into what we're sensing from just looking at it ourselves. Yeah. I think you have power, right?
I do. I have power.
You have the power.
Just a bit bigger. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Peter, for sharing all that about your work. I feel a lot of resonances with Peter and his work, just based on, you know, not just this interest in Hicks and Peaceable Kingdom, but also I born and raised in Pennsylvania as well, in Chadds Ford, and went to school here. I've lived here most of my life. Now work in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, in the same county where Edward Hicks painted. So, you know, I've always been very interested in place in my research and writing and curatorial practice, and also especially interested in connections between art and environment too, which comes out in a lot of my work as well. And materiality, I think, is also really fascinating.
So I'm going to talk. You know what? Before I let you dive in, I'm going to ask you to answer that question that I asked Peter, which is, how did you decide that you wanted to make your life in art?
That's a great question. I grew up in an auction family. So my family owns and operates an auction company called Briggs Auction near the Delaware border, Pennsylvania, off of 95. And I was always surrounded by things and objects and art growing up, just like, you know, stuff would come in every week and then go back out. And I just was always fascinated by it. And that kind of led me to art history. I also, you know, majored in studio art as well in undergrad, but for some reason always knew that that was never going to be where I, you know, ended up. It was more to help my understanding of art of the past. And I think, as I think many of us do, that art is a very powerful medium for telling us about about place, about past, about cultural values and beliefs. And also it challenges us. And I think that's what keeps it exciting for me.
Yeah, that's great. I feel like it helps us understand ourselves as well as humanity in general, because the two sides of the same coin. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on Hicks, like who he was and why he was painting this subject so obsessively, as we learned over 60 versions of the Peaceable Kingdom, and also just more about this subject matter, and particularly I'm going to talk about Penn's treaty with the Indians as well, and the kind of complicated backstory of that image. So Hicks was born in Langhorne, Pennsylvania in 1780, and he's best known today, as we've learned, for his multiple paintings of the Peaceable Kingdom. So here I'm showing you Worcester's version that Peters is familiar with and guarded. And also I'm showing you a portrait by his cousin, Thomas Hicks, that's in our collection. And you can actually see a little hint of the Peaceable Kingdom in the background. So that's what he's working on in his portrait. So Hicks learned the art of painting while decorating coaches as a coachmaker's apprentice. And this led him to eventually paint household objects like farm equipment and signs. And I love his signs. I'm showing you some of his signs in the Mercer collection. These were actually recently on view in an exhibition of their art collection. The Mercer Museum is right across the street from the Michener Art Museum in Doylestown. You can imagine the confusion from visitors.
Yeah.
Very similar names. And this is my favorite Hicks sign, the Henry Van Horn signboard that's in Williamsburg, because it advertises Van Horn's carpenter services from the cradle to the grave.
Indeed.
So after a self-described wayward lifestyle as a young man, Hicks joined the Society of Friends in 1803 and became a Quaker minister about a decade later. Decorative painting, however, was antithetical to Quaker beliefs in simplicity and plain utilitarian living. Although he unsuccessfully attempted farming for a short period, Hicks never gave up his chosen vocation. And he actually wrote many years later in his memoirs that his nature, quote, presented formidable obstacles to the attainment of that truly desirable character, a consistent and exemplary member of the Religious Society of Friends, one of which is an excessive fondness for painting, quote. But I should note, though, that Hicks was not the only Quaker, I guess, towing the line of material possessions and plainness and utilitarianism, because many wealthy Quakers in Philadelphia also decorated their homes with the latest fashions and sat for portraits, too. So actually, as far as we know, easel paintings were not a significant part of Hicks's business, so he didn't derive a lot of income from them, despite the number of works that survive today. And I say easel paintings here, meaning that work that's meant to be hung on a wall, so not sign painting, or more utilitarian like painting for advertisements and things. So it's believed that he made these paintings primarily for his friends and other Quakers who had a close relationship with Hicks's ministry. Many do not appear in his shop records, so he may not have even received compensation for them, and instead gave them away as gifts. Hicks used his paintings, and particularly his Peaceable Kingdom paintings, to visually explore and express his religious beliefs and engage in ongoing debates within the Quaker community. So he created his paintings when there was a tension between two factions of Quakers. There were the Hicksites, who rallied around Hicks's cousin, Elias Hicks, who was also a minister, and they believed in the importance of one's inner light in guiding individual faith. Orthodox Quakers, on the other hand, upheld the spiritual authority of the Bible and wished for a greater connection to British Quakers. So scholars have argued that Hicks's Peaceable Kingdom paintings are centered around this idea of peace between the two factions. And I'm just showing you a couple other examples, one from the Mercer Museum, the other from the National Gallery of Art. And here's an earlier one from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So you can sort of see with these paintings how his style also changes as he goes through time here. This is from the 26th. And then these other two are from the 30s. So very different, very similar, but different in composition. So these works, as we've already heard, illustrate the passage from the book of Isaiah, quote, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and the little child shall lead them." So Hicks' visualization of this passage expresses the denial of self-will communicated through inner light as a means of establishing harmonious coexistence. And Hicks believed that Pennsylvania's Quaker founder, William Penn, exemplified spiritual freedom as the foundation of civil liberty. And he began incorporating a scene of Penn's treaty with the Lenape in his Peaceable Kingdoms early on. Together, these two scenes, one based in Hicks's understanding of American history with William Penn, and the other projecting a lesson of harmony and peace grounded in his religious faith, really embodied this ideal utopic vision for the future, as Peter has already talked about and explored in his work too. So when composing these paintings, Hicks combined imagery from both religious and secular texts and sources, creating a rich collage of visual references that period viewers would have recognized. So he relied upon widely circulated prints and engravings as source material, which I kind of liken to creating a meme in a way today. So he's really, you know, if you think of these prints as like images that just proliferate, you know, throughout North America, but throughout the globe, he's pulling from all these different sources within his work. And so you can see how he's doing that in this this is his first Peaceable Kingdom painting that's at Yale. And you can see the prints that he was looking at when composing this work. And in the background under the Natural Bridge in Virginia is Penn's Treaty. And so Hicks copied this subject from Benjamin West, whose version became extremely popular soon after its completion in 1772. And this painting is at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. It was commissioned in late 1770 or early 1771 by Thomas Penn as a tribute to his late father, William Penn. And the painting reasserted the Penn's hereditary claim to Pennsylvania and rewrote Thomas Penn's own history of less than ethical dealings with the Lenape. So Penn's treaty with the Indians is really more deeply entrenched in and concerned with the political and economic situation of the late 18th century than the actual occurrences of the late 17th century when this purported treaty would have occurred. So it is, as Peter has already said, it's essentially propaganda. The history of Penn's treaty is murky at best. Scholars have long debated when and where such an event took place, if it did in fact occur, and even what the contents of the treaty were. So there's no specific document of the treaty as depicted by West and Hicks, you know, both figures. So here Hicks's pen, for example, is pointing to a document, even though we don't know of a document that exists. But it is generally accepted that Penn and his agents conducted several meetings with Lenape in Pennsylvania in around 1682 or 1683. Even though the walking purchase of 1737, in which William Penn's heirs confiscated 1.2 million acres west of the Delaware River to sell to new settlers, the myth of Penn's treaty persisted and even flourished by the late 18th and early 19th century. And West painting provided really a concrete visual narrative for the event that very quickly became its de facto image. And soon after it was exhibited in London in 1772, an engraving of the painting was produced and it was widely disseminated throughout the Atlantic world. So this is an example of like an image going viral, right? And it appeared on textiles in China and other printed materials that could be purchased and consumed at a relatively low price. So Hicks probably never saw West painting in person, and instead he would have copied this widely circulated print by John Hall. And you can tell that because his composition follows the reversal of the print. So the print reverses the painting, and that's what Hicks captures in his work. So why the mass appeal of this image, and why was it so appealing in particular to Hicks that he would regularly incorporate it into his Peaceable Kingdom paintings? And the obvious answer is that Penn's treaty was a significant event in American Quaker history and one that embodied the ideals of peace and spiritual independence that Hicks promoted in his sermons. For Quakers, Penn's treaty demonstrated the effectiveness of pacifism and justice in political and economic negotiations. By combining Penn's treaty with the book of Isaiah's Peaceable Kingdom, Hicks positioned the peaceful gathering of Penn, Quakers, and Native Americans, presenting, you know, in Hicks's view, both the savage and civilized to Anglo-American viewers as prefiguring peace during the future reign of Christ, when the leopard shall lie down with the king, as the Bible verse quotes. But there is another, I would argue, implicit message or goal in Hicks's and West's images of Penn's treaty, and that is to firmly place the Lenape in the historical past. And I think you can see here in this image, while the merchants of Penn's treaty are placed near the water, which is the Delaware River, which links them to the Atlantic Ocean and Europe, from which their goods originated, and therefore, links them to trade and prosperity. The Lenape are earthbound and also close to being pushed out of the picture plane entirely in this image. And Hicks I think, is interesting in the way that he delineates space within his Peaceable Kingdom paintings. And you'll see there's it's almost like the Peaceable Kingdom here is separated from Penn's treaty by this this kind of crevasse here. And it also carries through in the front as well. And I argue that that is to signify that this is the spiritual realm, and we don't actually have direct access to it. And that's kind of in line with his Quaker beliefs, and it's not, by showing that there's this demarcation, you're not seeing, something that can be tangible and claimed. And the Lenape are even farther removed from that, like in where they're positioned here in this image. They're at the steepest kind of part of the crevasse, where Penn and his agents, it almost seems like they could just kind of hop across. They're more closely connected, I would say, visually. Yeah. So ultimately, his Peaceable Kingdoms, while inarguably invested in preserving and commemorating the memory of William Penn, solidifying social networks, and reinforcing ideological and political values of the young United States and Quakerism, they also imparted these troubling ideas about Anglo and Native American relationships in the early 19th century, and ones that would have, been familiar to the consumers of his paintings as well, or soothing perhaps to them as they recognize, as they would have recognized that the Lenape, were no longer threats in their minds, or didn't have any more claim to the land that they occupied. So I'm going to end there, but happy to take any questions and talk more about Hicks and also more about Peter's work.
Thanks, Laura. That's so enlightening, and just to hear all those conversations about the connections, and I love that you liken it to a meme. That's amazing. I love just his combination of sources within his work, which wasn't unusual at the time for artists. I'm noticing that he omits the buildings that are in the background of the West, which always seems so strange to me. Of course, there weren't buildings yet. If this is really what they're trying to say it is, there were no Western looking houses. And I don't know if Hicks just sort of realized that, or if they were too complicated. I don't know. Yeah, I think because I imagine it's because he's still kind of thinking of this as almost like an Edenic space. And so he didn't want to insert or mess with the constructed landscape at all, and just kept it to the natural environment. It is interesting that West includes them, and I think that's because it's another way to lay Anglo-American claim to the land. We've built on it and the Lenape have not, and so therefore we are really the landowners. It's just reinforcing that, again, propaganda. But Hicks doesn't ever include the buildings. But again, I think it's because of this utopic vision, he keeps it within the natural landscape. Right. I mean, as you're saying, the painting it's really about heaven in the future, not so much about now. And maybe that's why there's this intent to sort of show fairness. It's, the part of the myth is that it was a fair deal that we, as the Europeans came and had a treaty, and there's always this bolt of cloth, and cloth was so expensive and valuable at the time, that trying to show that something valuable was given in return, which of course we know is not true, or certainly wasn't valuable enough. And I think that, Peter, is that we've talked a little bit about this, going back to the mythology of what the painting is trying to present, and then how you've connected that directly into your sculptures and the reality of today that you're trying to project.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think thinking about mythology and kind of how I was writing about it for the show statement, I always try to think about like the mortality of the mythology, right? And then how that can be tied into materiality. And so I think, like there's so many holes in the story and that kind of predicates these paintings and how, we see them now. But it probably was pretty effective propaganda in its original context. And I think like looking at like my work, like there's a literal porosity to it. But I hope that also like that mirrors a conceptual porosity or like kind of, a fallibility within it. And so it's like, like straw, as we know, like disintegrates to dust, like the clay itself is not fired into a truly permanent state. It is stabilized for the sake of making the artwork. Everything's kind of hanging on an armature, right? So it almost points to like I've had one friend describe these animals that I made almost as if they're like stuffed animals, right? And I love that kind of energy that they kind of present. And I think in a way they kind of, they still kind of naively like mimic or relate to like Hicks animals as well.
Well,
that way.
I'll just take that one step further. Maybe this was your intention. Like stuffed animals they're comforting, and I think Hicks's painting it's supposed to comfort us, or us. It's supposed to comfort certain people to make them feel like they were doing the right thing, or that also to be comforted that they will be in heaven at some point. And there's that people feel comforted when they're surrounded by these sort of docile looking animals, even though they are in fact often ferocious. They don't feel ferocious in your case, and neither do they in Hicks's painting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just like, building up that idea of artifice. I think that's really like where my headspace was. And just like I always love that duality of something being an image, but also being like what it's composed of, right? So it's like, you can look at these guys behind me and be like, I see the straw, I recognize the raw clay, I recognize the burlap or the fiber that's been woven into it. But then I also see this image. And so like, I think it's always important to create like almost like a cognitive dissonance with the work, right? So it's like if you came in here with a small child, they'd probably just definitely be comforted saying like, oh wow, it's just a bunch of like relatively kind looking docile animals. But then like in my head as an artist, and maybe it doesn't matter if it's fully legible, like I'm definitely thinking about like, okay, like these are like barely tenable things that I'm putting together, right? Like the lamb, it's like there's an entire bag of cotton balls in there, guys, right? Like it's like it's like, I think that's relatively strange to just be like, I'm making these really disparate, really common materials like perform in a certain way, and it's just a performance in space.
And it almost, I haven't seen the work in person, but it looks like your sculptures are unraveling, right? Like they're frayed at the edges, and you can see, like you said, the materials they're made of. So again, it goes back to this, like you said, idea of artifice, or there's something haunting about them as well, even though they appear docile. Yeah.
Well, there's that tension of, when is our society going to unravel? When are all these preconceptions going to be shown to be false? And I think optimistically, Peter, you said that we don't believe the propaganda anymore, but I think there are plenty of people probably who do still kind of look to these paintings and the myth of Penn Street and think that these are reasons to suggest that things were done fairly. And
I think like, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like what makes me excited about these older objects or these older source materials. Is that like, I think, it would be too easy, and again, actually a demonstration of privilege for people to take these objects out of view, right? And not deal with that history and not deal with framing it in a way that is reflective of the society we do want to live in and the world we do want to build. And I think, like you walk past it and there are elements of its original design that are still completely effective, right? Like it lulls you into complacency. You're like, oh, that's just a nice peaceable kingdom. Everything's great. Like this is, the way things should be. But then you take a deeper look, and I think that's how it's like people always ask me a question like, why do you look at old stuff? Like, how does that have anything to do with right now? And I'm like, it has so much to do with right now, right? Like, I feel like we're just like sitting on top of this. And so I feel like, it's just, for me, it's like, I usually don't draw conclusions. I feel like I love the word to problematize. I'm just kind of thinking around it, and I'm using materials to kind of navigate that murky territory. So like, hopefully, others are comfortable in sitting in ambiguity with that work too, but I think that's where it gets exciting, or where like layers can start to work with each other in the work.
And that's physically so present, like all those words you just used, layers, porosity, even sitting with. Can you turn the camera through
yeah,
so we can see the straw man?
So let's see if I can turn it.
If anybody wants to come and sit with ambiguity, you are welcome to sit with ambiguity in the gallery. Right, Peter?
Yep. So I like definitely try to create like a viewing space with seating that will let you almost like viscerally smell and feel like the materials that compose these images. And I think, that's just another way of kind of tying into maybe like the period or like the time, that the source material comes from. But like, sitting down on scratchy straw and just looking at an object composed of it, I think there's like a nice connection between the body that way.
That ties directly into what you were saying about your students. Like, you want people to notice what's around them. Sometimes you have to be uncomfortable. Making people uncomfortable is what makes them notice their surroundings, which can just, that can, again, be drawn to this whole idea of the fact that our society, our culture right now has been built on these false narratives, and that we have to notice them in order to go past them or move on from them. And this ties directly again back to your chimera definition, right? What was the second definition? Something hoped for but possibly unattainable.
Yep. Or that's illusory or impossible to achieve. So again, and then maybe I'm being too much of a pessimist, and it's not my point. It's not my hope that, a better future is an impossibility. But I do think like sometimes people throw so much weight on these ideas of utopia that fly in the face of like what the real engines of history are, and like the real nature of humans tends to be. And I think that's something that, again, it's like sitting with that discomfort, sitting with that ambiguity, thinking about how like as a human I can conceive of utopia, yet have I ever really felt like that is something that is real or not fantasy? I don't know, it's just stuff that churns around in my brain as I'm working in studio for sure.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna just ask you, I think you're tethered to the wall, but can you get the computer closer so we can kind of see the side view? I think this is a nice chance to give people an opportunity to see the work up close, if anyone here is not going to get a chance to come in person, although I highly recommend that you come either tomorrow night. Friday is First Friday, so we're going to have an opening from 5 to 7:30 with Peter's work, and also Copal Seth, who's a current resident, has an exhibition up, and at 5:30 they'll give remarks. But you definitely need to come and see these things in real life. But do you want to just pick up your computer and like get a little closer to the lion at least, maybe, or one of those guys, so people can see there?
Let me know if it,
Yeah, I love the side view too, because you kind of don't get that in the, there we go. Look how great.
They come off the piece by about 10 to 12 inches. And then you can see it's on that, as I showed in the process pics, that steel mesh that's just kind of suspended by wood mounts.
I really appreciated how they're at the same time that they seem disintegrating, they seem very ephemeral, they seem like sort of conceptually tenuous, like you were saying. They actually are very stable. They're beautifully built onto these box forms, and they were so easy to install as a curator. It's nice, we carried them off the truck and pretty much just put them right on the wall in really well thought out way that you built them, Peter. So thank you for doing that.
I like how I think when you look at them, you can get it, even if you're not seeing your process shots, you can get a real sense of like the way you made them. Like you get a sense of someone building up the clay into these many, and straw and other materials in these many different layers. Like I like that idea. Like you can really get a sense of that just by looking at the finished work, which is great.
Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that process being really forward. So I wanted to ask if anyone has any questions and just ask Peter and Laura to think of any last remarks that they want to make. Someone in the chat has said, Carmen says, stuffed animals or scarecrows. Are you asking us to pick? Or are you suggesting it's both? I think maybe they're both. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions that come to mind?
Do you have any more shows lined up for them?
For these particular pieces, not currently.
But you would prefer to show it as an entirety, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to conceive of ideas like as a set or as an ensemble. And so I definitely do think, you know, I would love it if someone fell in love with just one piece and needed to live with it, and I would welcome that outcome as well. But I do think of them as like, especially as diptychs. So like, you know, it's almost like an exhibition in thirds. Like there's the 3 diptychs, and so, you know, in an ideal world, in a peaceable art kingdom, someone might buy like 2 of them, or I might be able to hang on to all 3 of them and show them again in a different reconfiguration, right?
Thanks, Diana. Corey says, I love the wild abandon of the materials, but she missed, how did you stabilize them?
Yes, that's a great question. So lots of different ways, and a lot of it just comes from kind of like intuitively experimenting with work. So, I mean, in some instances, it's literally just like fiber plus clay, like the clay becomes the binder on the fiber, and that's it. For most of this work, like the bottom halves of these paintings, there is Portland cement and Elmer's glue mixed into it. And the Elmer's glue, to my understanding, almost creates like, in its own way, like a plastic fiber or a polymer fiber inside of it. And then the Portland cement gains strength as it, you know, slowly cures over time and absorbs, you know, the CO2 or whatever from the atmosphere with moisture, blah, blah, blah. And so like it kind of like lets the clay do its plastic stuff. And so in a lot of ways I can squish things and like do the clay, what I love about clay, but then I don't have to worry about facilitating a firing. And it allows me then to borrow the properties of other materials alongside everything.
Good answer. Good question. Good answer. And that is the underpinning, the conceptual underpinning of your work is mirrored by the literal physical underpinnings, which is another reason I love what you're doing. Julia says, what do you feel you learned with this body of work, and how do you see your work going from here? Continuing the exploration of this subject, or finding a new source?
That's an awesome question. I think like my brain, my attention span, I bounce around from all different kinds of source materials. So I'm not sure I would continue to work speaking to the Peaceable Kingdom, you know, in the next project. I think I learned a ton, like more than possibly ever from completing this body of work, which again, it's just, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to show here at the Clay Studio, and to kind of have that pressure to like mount a cohesive exhibit instead of just like scatteredly experimenting in studio. So again, like I think this is a relatively big departure for me to create like a body of work that lives on the wall and to figure out the mechanism to do that. I think I was more adventurous than perhaps ever before in terms of how much abandon I put with the material and how much I was just like willing to risk and just putting things right next to each other and saying it'll work. And I'm pleased at how it worked. And so I think, you know, the next step actually is to figure out like what the next thing for the wall or this particular format of armature is going to be. And also, if there's room in that space, then suddenly start to actually reincorporate fired ceramics as part of these like mixed media compositions. So I'm really excited to kind of actually start to conceive of a project that might do that. And like what that means when something very permanent that will last for a very long time is framed or mounted in something that has like very different material lifespans.
Yeah, and I love that, to add on what we were talking about earlier today, just in terms of the learning process that any situation you find yourself in, it might not seem ideal at first, but can bear fruit. Like, the fact that you went from Philadelphia, being here in the studio, to being in Pittsburgh and having to then kind of figure out how to get the work back here is problem solving, which is tied directly into art making and creativity. And when all of those things kind of come together in this beautiful way, make this amazing work. We have another question, and this will, I think, maybe be our last one, although if people have other comments and questions, please put them in the chat. I do share them with our visitors. I love the impermanence, Ray says, I love the impermanence of the material language in correlation with the impermanence of the narratives. What is your favorite stage in the process? When do you most feel at flow?
Well, thanks for tuning in, Ray. It's great to see you again. And thanks for your question. My favorite point in the process, oh gosh. I mean, I think it would be like right after I finished making the actual like under armature. So like that first image in my slides where it was like just the wood box and the metal. Like once that part's done, which I find very like annoying because it's very precise. Well, for me, it's very precise. And it has to be very, measured and meticulous or it won't work. I think my favorite thing is when I just start to like block out the gesture and figure out the composition and like have the most visceral, like first layer kind of goopily added on. Because I think like that's the moment where everything else is decided. So it's like this crucial middle step into understanding what is emerging in front of my face.
It just emerges. Sounds nice. Okay, so Peter and Laura, do you have any final remarks?
Thanks so much, Laura, for giving us your knowledge today. I really appreciated it.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for including me in this. It was great to learn more about Peter and his work. And yeah, I can't wait to see the exhibition in person.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. I really appreciate your time and always love to hear you talking about art history. I could have listened to that for probably 3 hours in a dark room. I was having all kinds of nice thoughts about art history class. And Peter, thank you so much for your beautiful artwork and your inspiration and for coming all the way here. And we hope that everyone joins us in person tomorrow night for First Friday. Thank you to all of our guests for coming. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you in